Hello, my Micto brothers. I'm back again. This time we're going to go into a little bit more of an esoteric topic, something within the realm of, say, a Stardust or a Barbar or even a Spizzness. So we're going to go a little bit away from the mundane and the current and delve into something a little bit, I say, more intellectual. It's been talked about a lot in the manosphere, especially in the MGTOW forums, about evolutionary biology and how that affects society and the interplay between male and female. A lot of what it leaves out is culture. It's the old argument, which is more important, nature or nurture, which I don't think there's an either or. Stardust says there's a zero-sum game going on between male and female in this society or as a species. He says because we are a dimorphic sexual species that there's going to be a constant battle between the needs of men and the needs of women. And I think that has a lot to do with his worldview, and his worldview as, say, an atheist, which tends to be more of a mechanical view, which I'm not going to dispute that. I disagree with Stardust that the human society is a zero-sum game. It's not an either-or proposition that one sex dominates over another. Human beings are a cooperative species, and for the species to be successful and move forward, there has to be a cooperation between the two. If you look at our laws, if you look at our rules, if you look at our societies, what we think of as biological traits or roles that fit the biology, and we're going to go into that, maybe not in this video, but in another video. So this is going to be the start of the discussion. This is just the intro, and we're going to go deeper into it. My argument is going to be based on Carroll Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, Chapter 2, Man and Culture, where he gives a great argument about the relationship between human beings, human culture, and nature. He argues that there is no separation between those three entities. All three interact fluidly with one another, while all three are changed by the other. Quigley gives a good example of what human instinct or human nature is and isn't compared to the other animals that survive almost solely on instinct. He then goes on to talk about what human culture is and the role it plays in developing that human nature to what he calls a human personality. Then how the personalities that form the culture change not only it, but the natural world that surrounds them. We'll argue that human culture has such a profound effect on behavior that it can't really be separated from human nature without a lot of difficulty. They both change each other and slowly influence our evolution over time. I'll argue that male and female roles and attitudes are only partially influenced by our nature. The other parts of the picture come from what our culture teaches and what our environment offers in a flexible, interactive matrix. I'll show that much of what we think is instinct, nature, revealing itself is not actual. What we are really seeing is culture affecting the human personalities within it. We'll get a clearer look at this dynamic process. This will lay the groundwork for later arguments in other videos. Getting a clearer look at all the components that make up the individual first, and then building into a culture, and finally a society and civilization will help put some of these confusing interactions into some kind of perspective. Finally, I'll give my opinions on what and why things happen in a culture and how those things affect the male-female dynamic how changes affect and direct the wants, needs, and goals of the personalities inside of the human species. In this section, what we're going to be doing is comparing instinct and culture. Carroll Quigley uses the sea turtles as an example. He talks about how sea turtles go ashore and bury their eggs in the hot sand, knowing that the heat will cause them to hatch. He explains what emerges is not so much a baby turtle, but a small turtle that has most of its wiring or instincts already intact. So with no mother to look after it, it is able to survive and grow on its own. It feeds, avoids predators, and navigates the oceans purely on instinct. It has no need to be taught by its parents. It is born completely able to function in its natural environment without help. By contrast, a human baby is born completely helpless. By design, it has very few of its natural instincts and very little of its wiring already hooked up, which is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that this design allows for enormous flexibility. Human beings can adapt to a wide range of conditions and climates. The downside is that the rearing process takes an enormous amount of time. Since it doesn't have the majority of its wiring or instincts already hooked up, it is completely helpless. The way these wires or connections get hooked up, or whether they get hooked up at all, depends on what happens to the child as it grows up. We all know about children that were lost as babies and raised by wolves, that are never able to talk or really walk upright because during the critical period of development, they never experienced human language or other human abilities. So for this exercise, we're going to describe all the potential connections that the human mind can make as human potentialities. And those potentialities we're going to call human nature. The connections that are made through training and experience we're going to call human personality. Now, Quigley makes it clear that human personality is only a small subset of human nature. It can be argued that at birth, that most people have the potential for being aggressive or submissive, selfish or generous, cowardly or brave, even to some point relatively masculine or feminine. What qualities are brought forth to form a human personality depends on how each person is trained. For example, compare how boys and girls were trained in the 1950s, say versus the 1990s. Most would say the females that were trained during that period were a lot more docile and pliable compared to their male counterparts. Under feminism, the females that were trained in the 1990s are a lot closer in aggression to their male counterparts. So there is a very strong correlation between training and experience and personality. While not all personalities are the same, they all share a very consistent traits amongst individuals. This is, of course, evident from the consideration already mentioned, namely that human beings are helpless at birth and must be cared for and trained during a period of many years. The way in which they are cared for and trained depends largely on the personalities of the people whom they encounter as they are growing up. But these personalities again depend on the way which these adults were reared. Thus, there appear in any society certain patterns of action, of belief, and of thought that are passed on from generation to generation, always slightly different, both from generation to generation and from person to person in any single generation, but possessing a recognizable pattern. This pattern depends not only on the way people are trained to act, to feel, and to think, but also more concrete manifestations of their own social environment, such as the kind of clothes they wear, the kind of shelters in which they live, the kind of tools they have for making a living, the kind of food they eat and how they eat it, the kind of toys they have to amuse themselves, as well as the kind of weapons they have to defend themselves. All of these things, patterns of action, feeling, and thought, as well as concrete objects used in these activities, are known in the social sciences as culture. In the last section, we talked about human nature, human potentialities, and human culture. Human potentialities develop through training. In this section, we're going to talk about human culture. Human culture we define as a social heritage passed down by the trained human personalities in the social group, and how this social heritage, even while differing slightly from person to person and generation to generation, forms consistent patterns of actions, feelings, and thoughts inside that social group. While other creatures are surrounded by their natural environment, human beings interact on a different plan. Human culture intervenes as a kind of buffer between them and their natural environment. This active buffer penetrates humans on one hand and the environment on the other, changing both. The human being's neurological reactions are largely determined by culture, and at the same time, through culture, human beings modify their natural environment by activities such as building homes, cooking food, cutting down forests, draining swamps, and killing off dangerous animals. Throughout human history, human culture has modified the face of the earth. This is what makes human beings so complex. Instead of the normal twofold dynamic as with other creatures, the animal surrounded by its natural environment, human beings have a threefold dynamic. The human being surrounded by his culture and both surrounded by the natural environment. For example, when a turtle lays dozens of eggs in hopes that some turtles from those eggs can be carried into maturity by obedience to its fairly rigid instincts, survival of its species is dependent on a few surviving out of the many. Human beings, on the other hand, have very few offspring and almost no rigid instincts. Along with a long maturation period, the survival of mankind depends on almost all of its offspring surviving. Since each member is very valuable, they must be reared and trained not only to take care of themselves, but to add benefit to the culture. There are two things culture has to deal with. One is the wide gamut of human potentiality, and two, the drive to make those potentialities actual. These potentialities range from the concrete, material needs, through the emotional and intellectual, and into the spiritual. There have been many experts who tried to classify these potentialities, but for this exercise, we're going to use Dr. Quigley's categories: military, political, economic, social, religious, and intellectual. Since the levels of culture arise from men's efforts to satisfy their human needs, we can say that every level has a purpose. Military, the need for group security. Political, the need to organize interpersonal power. Economic, the need for material wealth. Social, the need for companionship. Religious, the need for psychological certainty. And intellectual, the need for understanding. This range of human potentialities is also the range of human needs because of man's vital drive that impels him to seek to realize his potentialities. This drive is even more mysterious than the potentialities it seeks to realize. Men have debated and theorized about this drive since the dawn of mankind. Still, we haven't come close to a definitive answer. All we can say is, when these potentialities of human nature are realized, they become the characteristics of human personality. This is very helpful, for we cannot directly observe or study human nature, and are compelled to make assumptions as to what it must be like from our studies of human personality. Since the characteristics of human personality emerge from the potentialities of human nature as a result of experience and training, and since each person's experience and training are different, each personality is different. Last section, we described human culture as an instrument for human personalities to actualize human potential by satisfying human needs. This culture we know as a social heritage is passed from one human personality to another. This social heritage forms a noticeable pattern of responses in personality in a social group. So how does this culture form the basis for the relationships between human males and females? To understand any cultural instrument, you must first look back to see why that instrument was developed in the first place. Our modern Western industrialized sexual roles are based on the nuclear family unit that was developed in Northern Europe. Before that, familial units were kinship-based, either patriarchal or matriarchal.
European groups are part of the Northern Eurasian and Circumpolar Culture Area. This culture area derives from hunter-gatherers adapted to cold, adverse climates. These culture areas are characterized by bilateral kinship relationships which recognize both male and female lines, suggesting a more equal contribution for each sex as would be expected under conditions of monogamy. There is also less emphasis on extended kinship relationships, and marriage tends to be outside the kinship groups. The historical evidence shows that Europeans, and especially Northwest Europeans, were relatively quick to abandon extended kinship networks and collectivist social structures when their interests were protected with the rise of strong centralized governments. There is indeed a general tendency throughout the world for a decline in extended kinship networks with the rise of central authority. But in the case of Northwest Europe, this tendency quickly gave rise, long before the Industrial Revolution, to the unique Western European simple household type. The simple household type is based on a single married couple and their children. It contrasts with the joint family structure typical of the rest of Eurasia, in which the household consists of two or more related couples, typically brothers and their wives and other members of the extended family. Before the Industrial Revolution, the simple household system was characterized by methods of keeping unmarried young people occupied as servants. It was not just the children of the poor and landless who became servants, but even large successful farmers sent their children to be servants elsewhere. In the 17th and 18th century, individuals often took up servants early in their marriage, before their own children could help out, and then passed their children to others when the children were older and there was more than enough help. This suggests a deeply ingrained cultural practice which resulted in a high level of non-kinship-based reciprocity. The practice also bespeaks a relative lack of ethnocentrism because people are taking in non-relatives as household members, whereas in the rest of Eurasia people tended to surround themselves with biological relatives. Simply put, genetic relatedness was less important in Europe, and especially in the Nordic areas of Europe. The unique feature of the simple household system was the high percentage of non-relatives. Unlike the rest of Eurasia, the pre-industrial societies of northwestern Europe were not organized around extended kinship relationships, and it is easy to see that they are pre-adapted to the Industrial Revolution and the modern world generally. This simple household system is a fundamental feature of individualist culture.
These units, although appearing different, were developed for one thing: the rearing of children. Earlier we discussed how, because of the comparatively few offspring and the long maturation period, the human species depended on rearing almost all of its members to adulthood. Those members helped not only with the propagation of the species, but the survival of the social group. For 6,000 years of agrarian history and 100,000 years of hunter-gatherer culture, every member was depended on to help feed and clothe the group. So naturally, sex roles in early societies were formed around children rather than sexual desire. Before the agricultural revolution, it took 20 people to provide food for 21 persons. So it is very evident that the value of every human member is high. The primary role of the human female is to acquire resources for the survival of her offspring. The type of mate, wealth, and social status enhances the odds of her progeny surviving. How these factors play out are largely affected by the natural and cultural environment that surrounds her. In one society where there are a lot of physical dangers, a man of great size is desired. Whereas in a society of leisure and security, a leaner, smaller man is more in style. Think of Mike Tyson versus a Brad Pitt. When we think of a male role as provider, it is to win a woman's heart. But actually, the man's provider role was originally to provide resources and protection to the group. The role was later bestowed upon his progeny. Social status was given to him according to his value to his community. Human society has reinforced these roles through various means and social instruments, such as male and female rites of passage and marriage. Male utility and female domestication are just aspects of the social heritage that have been passed down to ensure propagation and survival of the human race. So after all of that, what happened? What happened to the contract or the cooperation between male and female and society? We had established that survival of the species depended on almost all of its members surviving to maturation, not only to propagate the species, but also provide resources and protection to the society and the group. So why the breakdown? Why this division between the sexes? Quite simply, it was the two revolutions, the agricultural first and then followed by the industrial. If we look back and remember early in the section that before the agricultural revolution, it took 20 people to grow food for 21 persons. 150 years later, 3 or 4 people could do the same job. 200 years later, 3 people can grow food for 100 people. The Industrial Revolution that supplanted physical power with machines, 100 years later, cut the amount of workers to produce the same amount of material almost by the same rate. And continuing into the digital revolution, it cut it down to where we almost don't need workers at all. So what does that mean? It means that you don't need all of your members to survive to maturation. You don't need women to produce babies. You don't need the group to produce children. So children went from being a very much needed asset to a liability. See, in a group, an agrarian group especially, even hunter and gathering group, children of ages 4 or 5 years old can start helping provide resources for the group or provide labor for the group. When the agricultural revolution happened, children were no longer necessary as hands to produce food for the group. It was supplanted by gang plows and later machines. So now women that needed to produce 6 or 7 offspring could no longer afford or longer needed to produce that many. So we have that modern number of 2.1 children per couple, which is the rate of replacement. It takes 2.1 children to replace the people that are already here to keep the population stable. So as before, when you needed a lot of children and a lot of hands as labor, that was no longer necessary. So now, instead of it being, I would say, if you take into account of inflation, $100,000 worth of labor that you derive from having children, now it went to $150,000 of debt that you had to get to that child to maturation, because children are not able to work because of child laws and because of the complex society that we've developed. Even a child of 18, 19, and even 21 years old is not fully capable of participating in the labor force. So now that woman's role that she used to have of providing offspring, and even before that, the Industrial Revolution, providing labor around the household, is no longer necessary. Remember, it takes 2.1 children to stabilize a society or keep a society's population stable. If you fall below that, you fall below replacement level. So the state's obligation to its society's future is to make sure that it has enough children to keep the society's population stable, to keep the society from collapsing. You can look up on Google about aging populations and them not having enough babies or young people to actually care for, provide for people that have gone past their actual working age, their working life. And the dynamic societies are the ones that have a lot of young people, a lot of young energy. So how does a mature state, say like some place in Western Europe, or for our case, the United States, encourage people, or women in particular, to have those 2.1 children who are obviously liabilities now and not assets? You have to incentivize them. Now, how do you do that? You extract wealth from other people. You extract wealth from older people, and you extract wealth from men in particular. You do that through taxes. You do that through child support. And when there's not enough tax revenue to do it that way, you increase the burden that's put upon men. So as women, more and more women are reluctant to have children, you have to increase the incentives. So earlier in the United States history, child support was at the base level, just enough to keep the children alive, to feed and clothe, at a minimum, the children that didn't have fathers. As women entered the workforce and could provide for themselves and their own future, you had to up the ante, or up the incentive. So instead of asking for the minimum, or charging men the minimum that it took to raise the child, you transferred more wealth from that man to incentivize that woman to actually have those 2.1 children. If you look at the birth rate after 1970, when the marriage contract failed, the birth rate started to drop drastically. It dropped to the point where it was headed below replacement. So what is the state's response to that responsibility? They have to incentivize women to keep having children, with or without husbands. So how do you do that? You give her more alimony, you give her more child support, you give her more aid from the state, all in the hopes that she will give you those 2.1 children. So you can imagine men's reaction to the draconian burden that's been put on them by the state. They take their only option that's left to them, which is to withdraw. They pull back. They stop marrying. They stop having children. And it comes out in the forms that we see in the red pill manosphere, the pickup artists, the men's right movement, and lastly, the MGTOW movement. So to conclude, my argument is the study of evolutionary biology and the study of other species is helpful, but is only partially correct. If you leave out the impact of culture, then you're missing a vital portion of the puzzle. Human beings are more than just animals. We're built on a different plan. Culture is the buffer zone between us and our natural environment. And to study the evolution of our biology and not to study the evolution of our culture makes the picture incomplete. To understand any aspect of our society or any pattern of action in our society, you cannot understand it without the history of the culture that you're talking about. To quote Quigley, It must always be remembered that culture is a consequence of persons seeking to realize their potentialities sufficiently to satisfy their inner drives. Without human beings, there would be no culture. It is equally true that without culture, there will be no human beings, but only animals in direct contact with their natural environment.